Went in for my induction on May 16th. At my 36-week appointment, my doctor checked me for dilation. I was very surprised to find out that I was actually 3 centimeters dilated. So I really kept trying what I could try to induce labor naturally, aside from I didn't take castor oil or anything like that, but I just tried to do a lot of walking and other activities, and nothing really worked, but I was dilating, and so I thought there was a high chance for me to go into labor on my own. However, I was scheduled for an induction at exactly 37 weeks, and so I was hoping to go into labor before that, but the day came and so I did go into my induction. So I went into my induction on May 16th, which was a Wednesday, May 16th, 2018. And we went in at 7 in the morning, my husband and I. And at that time, they did a quick scan to see the position of the babies and noted that my son was still transverse. But my doctor felt pretty confident and suggested that I still try for a vaginal birth and that they would attempt to turn my son or to guide him into a head down position as my daughter was coming out. He said the chances were about 50-50 of it being successful, which scared me for sure. However, he also said that he would recommend that I try for vaginal birth because if I want to have more children, having at least one vaginal birth would make a future vaginal birth, or if I wanted to try for a VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean, more likely, even if I ended up having to have a C-section for one of my babies. So I decided to go on with that. I was really hoping to try for a completely natural quote-unquote birth in terms of not having an epidural, but given the risk of my son potentially needing a C-section and the fact that I didn't know how he would react once my daughter came out of the womb, and my doctor said if I had to have an emergency C-section and I didn't have an epidural that I would have to be put under general anesthesia and miss the birth of my son. To me, that felt like a no-brainer. I was not going to risk that. I wanted to be present, if at all possible, for the birth of both of my children. And so I opted to get an epidural when the time came. However, honestly, it was pretty slow going, the induction process, similar to most other induction processes that I have heard about. So I went in at 7, they did a scan, they determined that the positions were pretty much the same, and they started me on Pitocin. And just when I was in the hospital for my around 30, 31, 32 weeks, I was having contractions on the monitor. However, I wasn't really feeling them. I could feel the tightening, but it didn't hurt, and it definitely didn't feel like it was making progress. When I arrived at my induction, my doctor also checked my cervix for dilation, and I was 4 centimeters dilated. So I had really high hopes that I would go for a really quick induction, that things would move quickly, I would have the babies that night, and everything would be over and done with. However, that's not at all what happened. So basically, it was really kind of a boring induction process. I was having the Pitocin, I was having consistent contractions, I was not feeling them, and I did not have an epidural yet at this point. And I wasn't really progressing. Maybe I was progressing a centimeter every 7 or 8 hours, but it would be a different doctor checking me every time, or a resident, and they would have different fingers, and they would say it could be the same as last time, but I might have a different assessment. Really nothing was happening. I think by that night at around midnight, I was 5 centimeters dilated, and really, I think I maybe was closer to 100% effaced, but nothing obviously substantial given that I was 4 centimeters dilated at 7 a.m. that morning before the Pitocin. So my doctor suggested that they break my water and that things might start moving more quickly. I opted to have him do that the next morning because he was kind of, giving me the risks of breaking my water, and freaked me out that there was a small risk that there could be an umbilical cord prolapse, meaning that the baby's cord exits the cervix a little bit before the head, and then when the head comes down, it pushes on the umbilical cord and basically depletes the oxygen levels that are going to the baby. And that would require an emergency C-section. And at that point, since I really wasn't in very much pain, I didn't have an epidural. So again, I was really nervous, firstly about the health of my babies, obviously, but second, about not being able to see the birth of my babies. So I opted to try to give my body a little bit more time overnight. And still, when he came back at 7 a.m. The next morning, so I'd been there for exactly 24 hours, there was no change at all. And so he broke my water, and every once in a while after that, I would start to feel contractions here or there, but nothing major and nothing prolonged. Just a little bit of pain. I was trying to be a little bit mobile. However, there was an issue with the fact that I was on Pitocin, so I had to be monitored 24/7. The baby's heart rates had to be monitored 24/7. And at my hospital, they didn't have working twin wireless monitors. They had them for a single heartbeat monitoring system, but not for twins. So I had to be basically in bed, or like move positions, like bed to chair or bed to birthing ball, but for the most part I couldn't move very much. But I tried a lot of different things to get things going, and I think I got checked around maybe 12 noon, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was like 6 centimeters dilated, but like no real progress. I still wasn't feeling really the contractions. I still wasn't in pain. So the resident that was working with my doctor was really great, and at that point I had kind of just said, okay, I know I'm gonna get a C-section. It is what it is. Like, let's just do it then. And he looked at me and he said, no, like, we are still completely and totally confident that we can help you have a vaginal delivery, and we are not giving up on this unless you want to. And we have a few more things that we'll try before we go straight to C-section. The babies looked good. There were no decelerations in their heart rates, even when I was having contractions. They were doing all of the accelerations with movement that they were supposed to be doing. So he said, why don't we do this? Like, you've been here for a long time. We're gonna give you a 1-hour break from the Pitocin. You'll be able to walk around, take a shower, rest even, because at that time, like, I had to have all those cords strapped to me. I could really barely like sleep. I was constantly having to move to readjust so the heart rate monitors could catch the baby's heartbeats when they would move. So with that, I took a break, I took a shower. At that point, I was almost maxed out on the Pitocin. They had been increasing it by like 1 or 2 every few hours, I think. I don't really remember exactly. So they thought maybe my body was saturated with the Pitocin. Maybe if I get a little bit of a break, that it will work differently when they start it back up and they can increase it more rapidly. So after my break, they started me back on the Pitocin, and they said that this was their last ditch effort, which was to place this like balloon type monitoring device into my cervix to try to get a more accurate estimate of the strength of my contractions, to see if I was either, like, the options would be that I was having strong contractions, but the baby, which in my case was my daughter, baby A, was not like opening up my cervix, or for whatever reason my contractions weren't opening up my cervix, or that I wasn't really having strong enough contractions, and so that they needed to try to change the protocol for the Pitocin. So at that time, the resident tried to insert this monitoring device into my cervix, and it was excruciatingly painful. Excruciatingly painful. It hurt really badly. It felt like something was scraping in the inside of me, and yeah, it was really painful. And every time he would do it, I would put my legs back down and it would fall out. And so I think he tried 3 separate times, but after that, after even the first attempt, I was in excruciating pain, and all of a sudden, like, I don't really know. At the time, I just thought it was because of the monitoring device and it just kind of irritating my cervix, but then it became clear that actually I think I was feeling contractions now, finally. And what was weird about it was that I went from like not feeling contractions at all to basically feeling transition contractions, which were excruciatingly painful. And I think the fact that I didn't have like a ramp up to them at all was more challenging for me to deal with, because I had no pain, and then I had like very intense pain. So they gave me my epidural at that point, and after that my doctor checked me, and I was fully dilated. So this was probably about 7:30-ish on Thursday, May 17th. So I'd been there for approximately 36 hours or something like that. And finally I was ready to push. So given that I was having twins, I had to go to the operating room to push and to deliver the babies. So I was wheeled in there. I didn't do any practice pushing in my room, I think because my doctor assumed that with my rapid progression, I'm obviously was 10 centimeters dilated, but I'm not sure what station my daughter was at, if she was higher or lower, or what, but I think he anticipated that it would be a quick delivery from that point. However, it really wasn't. So basically what happened, I think, I had an epidural, so I couldn't really feel my contractions, but honestly, I felt like I could feel everything else that was happening down there, for lack of a better word. Any like touching, I could completely move my legs. I didn't try to walk, but I could scoot from the hospital bed onto the operating table by myself. So I'm not really sure if my epidural really worked, but at that point when I started pushing, all of a sudden my contractions were basically like they had been before. Like I was having them kind of on the monitor, but they weren't in full force, and I couldn't tell when I was having them, with a combination of having the epidural and them not being strong any longer. I pushed for about an hour or so in the operating room, and finally my daughter was born. And to be entirely honest, I had really high expectations of that moment, but there was so much going on, and I just remember feeling like relief and then on to the next thing. Like, I don't really remember processing the fact that I now had a baby in the world. They kind of sat her on me, but they did a quick check. The NICU team did a quick check over of her just to make sure everything was okay. But I kind of looked down at her, and I mean, I was happy, but it wasn't like the movie moment of like crying or so much excitement. I more was like, oh, like, thank goodness that's over. Like, what's happening now? Is my son okay? Is he turned the right way? Am I about to go in for major surgery? Like, given that my epidural isn't really like fully numbing me, like, will I have to be put under general anesthesia? At that time, my son remained transverse after my daughter came out, and my doctors were pushing him to try to do a rotation of him, And that again was excruciatingly painful. Even though I had an epidural, I feel like I could feel everything. I could feel one of the doctors, TMI alert, had his entire like arm up to his elbow inside of me, and it was so painful. However, it was well worth it because they were successfully able to turn my son, and he was head down, and I was very excited to not have to have a C-section. So I anticipated that I would then just push him out. But I guess like in the process, I'm not really sure if this happens for many twin deliveries, none that I really heard of, but my dilation decreased and my contractions started to go even more away. So basically I went from a 10 to like a 7, and I tried to push a little bit, but he was very, very high. I think like -4 station. And so they said, okay, like now you don't really have twins anymore, you have one baby, so you can just like be more of like a normal delivery and go in labor in the hospital room and push him out there when he's ready to come. So I went back to my room and was really unsure. I wasn't really prepared. All the stories I heard were that the second baby would come within usually a few minutes, sometimes like 30 minutes, maybe an hour, but I never heard of like multiple hours in between births. So my daughter was born at 9:15 p.m. on May 17th, and she weighed 6 pounds 12 ounces, which I was pretty surprised with how big she was, given the twins and that I was 37 weeks. And she was 19.25 inches long. And she was perfectly healthy. We got to hold her, and she was really, I think, really, really beautiful. After I got to my room to continue laboring for my son, again, like, I guess the issue of it all is that I was now like hours from having birthed my daughter, but if anyone has ever given birth before, they know that it's extremely painful. And for me, even with an epidural, I felt all of the pain, or so I think. I felt a lot of the pain, and I remember thinking like, I never want to do that again. But I had to do it again, and really soon. And so I went back to my room to labor with my son, and they kept checking me, and I just wasn't ready. So I actually labored in there for 4 hours before I was fully dilated again and ready to push for him. And I ended up having to push for 2 hours for my son to be born. And in that process, I guess I was also very tired. I was extremely swollen down there. I was extremely swollen. If you can imagine, like after a vaginal birth, your whole area has gone through a huge amount of trauma, and it continues to swell well after the birth. So I had 4 or 5 hours of it swelling, and basically then I was supposed to push another baby out. In addition, my daughter's placenta was still inside, so I had her umbilical cord hanging out, basically, like where they had cut it off. So that made my vaginal opening smaller, and I was extremely swollen. So I pushed for 2 hours with my son, and I 100% believe that I could have pushed him out. My doctor was not there for this delivery because he was not the doctor on call. He was kind enough to stay for my daughter's delivery, but then with all the time between, he went home because it was the middle of the night at this point. And so I had another doctor, and basically, I was in a lot of pain. I was crowning, and I'm unsure exactly why, but he said, "Do you want me to use a vacuum to extract this baby?" And I was like, I trust that if that's something you need to do, that you will do it. And so he just grabbed the vacuum and took him out. So he actually had a vacuum assisted extraction for his birth, and I'm not really sure why. I got the report of my birth and it said that he was having some variable decelerations, but that was not told to me at the time of giving birth. But in any case, when he finally came out, I was extremely elated. I was so relieved. I had been able to deliver them both vaginally, and it was finally over for the most part. At least the birthing process was over. I obviously still had to deliver my placentas. I had quite a bit of tearing, I think probably related to the swelling, but also related to the vacuum extraction. I also had a postpartum hemorrhage. They had to give me, I don't know what the name of the medication was, but a shot of some medication to stop me from hemorrhaging. But again, I was so relieved and elated that it was finally over. So my son was born at 3:26 a.m. on Friday, May 18th, 2018. He weighed 6 pounds and 14 ounces and was 19.5 inches long. So all in all, I had two pretty good sized babies for twins, I would say. Pretty comparable in size. I think I could make a whole nother video on my postpartum recovery. As a result of my hemorrhage, I had a lot of trouble walking afterwards. I was bleeding a lot, leaking all over the place, and I finally convinced the nurse that like this just couldn't be right. Like I couldn't even walk to the bathroom without feeling completely faint and out of breath, and this was hours after the birth. Throughout that whole next day, I couldn't even walk out of my bed to console my babies or to change their diapers. I had to have them brought to me without, like I said, just feeling completely faint and out of breath. So they checked my iron, it was critically low, and I basically just had a blood transfusion that night and felt 100, maybe not 100. I felt probably 90% better. Still very sore, but better overall. I was so lucky, so blessed that my babies were healthy, and they both had jaundice, so that was a little bit of a struggle. They had to be under the lights for a few days, but it resolved and they got to go home when I went home. They didn't have any like major health issues, and I am so grateful. So just a little quick introduction, and excuse my daughter's hair. It is a little bit wild. She really just got a bath last night, I promise. But this is my daughter, Calla Elizabeth. So she was my baby A. And she is currently 6 months old and a very sweet little baby. And this is my son, Jude Harris, and he was my baby B. And again, he is almost 6 months old. I definitely think it's cool and very unique that they have different birthdays. I have never personally met twins that have separate birthdays, or if I have, usually they were born like right over midnight. Like one was born around the 11 o'clock hour, one was born around the 12 o'clock hour. So I think they have a really interesting and unique birth story. Additionally, I feel like I have a pretty unique birth experience. So yeah, I hope that this video was helpful, maybe enlightening about a potential option for how a birth might go if you are expecting twins. Obviously, doctors will have different opinions and different protocols for how to handle things, but it's definitely an interesting possibility. So thank you so much for watching, and maybe I'll see you soon. Bye.